Talking about the mayoral contests with Tony Travers, talking about London primarily, and then a new face for these briefings, Robin Hambleton, who is going to be focusing on the Bristol contest. So, usual format, our speakers will speak for about half an hour between them, and then we'll move on to questions. Tony?
Okay, thank you very much. I'll stand up if I may. I just feel better standing up. Right, now, there are actually 4 mayoral contests. I thought there were 3 until I spoke to David Cowling, who reminded me that there's a 4th. 4 mayoral contests this year. London, which I'm going to talk about now, the 5th such contest in London. Bristol, which Robin's going to talk about. And then also Salford, where it's the 2nd contest as well, and Liverpool. We're not going to talk about Salford and Liverpool much today. Safe to say that I think both Salford and Liverpool look like Labour hold, in the one case for the incumbent and the other for in Salford's case for a new left-of-centre candidate. Now, just get the big tables, the bombardment of statistics over. I mentioned David already, but David, of course, actually worked at the GLC, and this is looking at the vote share in GLC elections and London Assembly list elections, right the way back to the beginning of the GLC. I mean, of course, there are different voting systems. Well, the GLC was first past the post. The GLA Assembly list, which isn't quite the same as the mayor, obviously, is a PR type system. So just aiming off for that, what you see, of course, over time is that the Conservative and Labour votes in the Assembly elections, say possibly Labour in 2012 in fairness, good year for Labour 2012 as we've heard before, and here this last week from Colin Runnings and Michael Thrasher, good year for Labour. But the vote shares in these elections for the Assembly much lower than they used to be for the parties back in the first past the post GLC days, and the number of seats correspondingly smaller. Interesting to see that the GLC in its early days had over 100 seats on the council. The GLA, of course, has just 25, and with the PR type system that's used to elect it, almost impossible for one party, given those vote shares, ever to win a majority. And the only reason this kind of matters is that on the Greater London Authority, the Assembly can override the Mayor's budgets and some policies if they can get a 2/3 majority for an alternative proposition. That also is extremely difficult and indeed has never actually quite happened. A bit of pluralism because of the PR voting system there. Greens have been elected on all occasions to the Assembly. UKIP on one occasion, and that became complicated because they changed their name in mid-term, and was once at BNP in 2008, and the BNP National Party was doing well, BNP won a seat as well. Now, it's often argued that London's becoming a Labour city, or the question is London becoming a Labour city? And for a long time I resisted this thesis, but actually the truth is it is somewhat. And what this chart does is simply to compare, this uses general elections, the vote share in the general election in Britain compared with the vote share in London, and just looking at the difference in the two over time. And what you see is that for a long time, not only was London not a Labour city or indeed a Conservative city, it was actually the part of the country whose vote was closest to the GB average. So despite the fact London was a slightly odd place in other ways, in this one sense, in voting, its Conservative vote was very like the National Conservative vote, its Labour vote was very like the National Labour vote, and so on. But if you look at it from 1997 onwards, you can see that that red bar begins to grow above the line, and by 2015 is 12.5% above. And that suggests that Labour is doing relatively better now than in the GB vote share. The Conservatives actually are only slightly below the line, so it's not as if the Conservatives are being eaten by the Labour vote. What's happening, and very obviously in the last 2 elections, particularly in 2015, is that net Labour is winning votes from all the smaller parties, or from a number of the smaller parties. So the fragmentation that's occurred to other parties over time as the Conservative plus Labour voters declined in UK politics, in London, is apparently happening somewhat less, and that Labour is the beneficiary of that, at least in general elections, it would appear to be the case. Now, the GLA, the Greater London Authority, which is the collective name for the Mayor and Assembly, uses two voting systems. For the Mayor, the supplementary vote, where candidates can vote once for a first preference, and may use a second preference votes. If no candidate gets 50%, just over 50% of the first preferences, then the top candidate, two candidates go forward, and the others are knocked out, and their second preference votes for the first two candidates are then counted. That's how that system works. For the Assembly, the additional member system, there are 14 civil super constituencies, and they aren't very, very big. London's population is nearly 9 million, so these are very large constituencies. Those are the normal first past the post elections, and then there is another 11, so adding up to 25 members drawn from a party list, and that's a separate election. You vote 4 times in this election. You can vote 4 times. So you can vote Mayor first and second preference, Assembly for the local constituency, and for a party list. And then looking at the party list vote and the proportions for each party, there are candidates drawn off the list, so that overall the election achieves broad proportionality. That's how that works. So, what's happened in the previous elections? Well, Ken Livingstone's running all 4 of them is the first thing to note. Ken Livingstone, who had been leader of the former Greater London Council, for those of you with long memories, lived on to fight the Greater London Authority's first election in 2000 as an independent candidate. The Labour Party had chosen Frank Dobson to stand, and Livingstone ran as an independent and won. And I suppose what's interesting is he's faced 2 candidates, Steve Norris for the Conservatives in the first 2, Boris Johnson in the second pair. Now Boris Johnson, these are first and second preference votes added together, obviously doing substantially, not that substantially actually, better than Norris in 2004. But what intrigues me is that the margin of winning has fallen towards this fairly narrow margin. And the reason I think that matters is that, as I'll come on to say in a moment, even though the polls are showing one candidate somewhat ahead, the margin by the end in this forced choice is actually probably not going to be a very big one, and therefore a small change at the end could make a big difference. So just briefly, this is what happened in each of these elections. The figures have become somewhat adrift here. You can see the first preferences. In the first election, Livingstone got 29, then 37, Johnson 43, and then 44. Livingstone actually doing quite well in the second of these 2 elections as well. Sorry about the collapse of the table. Now, if we look at the poll of polls, this is a very unscientific thing to do, really. Well, it's not that unscientific, but the thing that deliberately does it. That doesn't make it unscientific, does it? If we look at the poll, all the polls that have been taken since the beginning of March, and add them up and divide them by the number of polls, you find Sadiq Khan, if you strip out all the don't knows, qualification, running at about 46, and Zach Goldsmith at about 38, and if you then, as the pollsters now do, look at the second preferences as expressed in the polls, you get a 54 to 46 margin. Again, not a very wide margin, certainly small enough for changes in the last 2 or 3 weeks to make a difference. Now, this time last week in this very room, Colin Rallings and Michael Thrasher produced this slide, which I have mercilessly stolen, looking at the national equivalent vote share back in 2012 and comparing it with their by-election model forecast of the likely, possible, based on by-elections figure this time. Now, it's true, a week is a long time in politics, and we've had a week since this, and it has been a long time in terms of the normal churn of politics. But, assuming these figures hold, and nothing radical is affected, or none of these are radically affected by what's happened in the last week or so, or indeed looking forward from here. So as of last week, compared with 2012, which was a good year for Labour, always worth remembering it was a good year for Labour, it was the best year they had actually between 2011 and 2014, the inter-election years. You can see that Labour's down 9, the Conservatives are down 2, suggesting a sort of 3.5% swing if you just look at it between the two of them, from a 3.5% swing from Labour to the Conservatives. Lib Dems up a fraction, UKIP up quite a lot, and the others also up a little. So what would that translate through to in an assembly vote? Now, in addition to the mayor, we have the assembly. So looking at the assembly vote, on the basis of that kind of rallies and threshold, these are my figures, not theirs, so can't blame them for these. It looks as if the Conservative vote will fall slightly. This is aiming off for the fact that London is a bit less likely to vote Conservative and a bit more likely to vote Labour, as I showed earlier. Labour vote's also likely to be down on 2012, so these figures highlighted here. So down somewhat. The Lib Dems possibly up a bit, the Greens down a bit, UKIP up substantially. Now, why does that matter? Well, it gives us a clue as to how the Assembly seats might fall out of this election. I'll come back to how all this is interpreted at the very end. Clearly, the mayoral election race is the thing that gets the most attention. It's very easy to understand. As I'll say at the very end, I'm not sure that the London mayoral election race tells us quite as much about national politics as the local elections will, or even the Scottish and Welsh ones. I realise we're here to talk about mayoral elections today, and I find this one very interesting, but if I'm honest, but the Assembly election might, interestingly, tell us a little bit more. It's more akin to the local elections outside London. So the underlying balance between the Conservatives and Labour, I think, in London in the Assembly list election will tell us something, as will the question whether the Lib Dems are doing it better and how well UKIP is doing. London often thought not to be a UKIP, particularly strong place for UKIP, but the truth is, in the last European elections, 371,000 people in London voted UKIP, and particularly in the outer east and the outer west of the city, in some parts of the south, there are substantial numbers of UKIP voters. We look at the 14 super constituencies, and I've simply listed them all here with the swing necessary, the Conservative to Labour swing. They're all held by the Conservatives or Labour at the Assembly level, at the constituency level. And I just put the swing required. You see, some of them are rock solid safe, mostly Labour ones, it is true, that are rock solid safe. So where is there a possible change? Well, I've sort of listed them: Barnet and Camden, Croydon and Sutton, Ealing and Hillingdon, Havering and Redbridge, Merton and Wandsworth. Likelihood of change, very little. I'm afraid this election is not won because of these very large constituencies, but particularly this time because of the fact that since 2012, if anything, there's a slight swing to the Conservatives. I think that the chances of any of these changing hands are relatively limited. That's not to say one of them won't. And for example, in Ealing and Hillingdon, which is clearly shifting leftwards, it might even build up a bigger Labour majority, though it's sort of marginal. So I'm not expecting a massive number of changes, as you can see from my likely column at the end on the right hand there. And this means that the Assembly composition, which at the moment is Conservatives 9, Labour 12, Lib Dems 3, Lib Dems 2, Greens 2, is, the Conservatives may well lose one, Labour may lose one, and then the question is, Lib Dems may pick one up, Greens may hold or lose one, UKIP may pick one or even two up. I think they're probably going to get one, but we'll see. And with the Euro election running so soon after, one would have thought that insofar as UKIP are ever going to do well in London elections, this election has got everything going for them in terms of, except when there's a Euro election on the same day, in terms of prompting the UKIP vote. So perhaps the two major parties falling back. I mean, intriguingly, given that this is a PR election, it's interesting, I was fascinated by the fact that here we've got Labour and the Conservatives winning 21 of the 25 seats in a PR election, a bit like Scotland. It's the British electorate, when faced with a PR election, thinks, look, we'll have a first past the post result again. Now, very briefly, London is, of course, famously now a city of minorities. In the 2011 census, it showed the OM Office for National Statistics shows the London population at that point, 55% non-white British. Now, non-white British is a category that includes people who are British and not white, and also people who are not British, so it's kind of quite a big category, but it's nevertheless the way they look at things. And about between 35 and 40% of London population born overseas, and about the same proportion are not white. So it's a city of a substantial minority and non-British nationality. Normally thought to be, particularly minority ethnic voters, most likely, very likely to vote Labour, and indeed traditionally that has been the case. But polling done after the general election, which supports work done by the BES after the last general election, as after the 2010 general election, is that there appears to be a growing propensity for minority ethnic voters to support the Conservatives. Now, how far that has gone in the 2015 general election, you've not yet seen. We'll find out when further analysis of the 2015 election is published from the BES. And then looking at religion and voting, again based on the 2015 elections and polling for British Future, this suggested that, across the country I might add, that actually amongst some religious groups, Sikhs and Hindus, Conservative voters there may be more voting for Conservatives than Labour. So, and if you look at some of the London election results in the 2015 general election, it's inevitable that this must have been the case in some places like Harrow, for example. It would be impossible for this not to be. So all I'm saying is sort of being slightly cautious about the idea that the minority ethnic vote now always votes Labour or ever always voted Labour. It didn't. It may, if anything, be shifting somewhat towards the Conservatives, which, if it happened, would have profound impacts over time. So,
what is just for London or national?
Sorry?
Is this national?
This is national, actually. This is national. It's just a classic opinion poll for the country as a whole. So it is national, absolutely. But given that London has by far the largest minority population, this will, about 40% of this impact will have been from London in a national poll. So, I think London has, just to conclude, London has marginally become more of a Labour city since 1997. As I said earlier on, if Sadiq Khan were to win, personally I think that would be less revealing about British politics than what the local elections as a whole will tell us. If London is a Labour city, I haven't said in this set of slides, but if you look back right the way through to the creation of Greater London in 1964, the Conservatives and Labour have never won it more than twice back to back. It's never happened. The Conservatives have won it twice in 1967 and 1970. Labour, if you count Livingston's Labour, won it twice in 2000 and 2004. The Conservatives under Boris Johnson in 2008 and 2012. So it's a fairly plural place, London. So I'm not saying Sadiq Khan will win, but the polls show him ahead at the moment. But if he does, I think it's less revealing, as I said, than the local elections are. There's some evidence, as I just said, that the minority ethnic vote may be shifting towards the Conservatives. Now, some of it at least. Crucially, outer London, which used to be thought as absolutely safe for the Conservatives, and the reason that arguably outer London was originally added to inner London to create greater London back in the 60s, it was argued at the time this would make it easier for the Conservatives to win, which it did. But it's now much less easily won by the Conservatives than in the past. And the reason for that is that outer London now has as mixed a population in many boroughs as inner London. And it's now, the fact is that London remains a city of remarkable churn and mixing, people moving around. And there's no part of the city that is all rich. I mean, most of it is not all rich or all poor, and in fact outer London is now mixed than it once was, so much less easier for the Conservatives, for example, still simply to go for an outer London strategy. The London mayoral model is now embedded. It was the first directly elected mayor. We now have several covering smaller jurisdictions, smaller municipalities. And what I think is interesting about this one is that it's the first that's a non-celebrity contest. I mean, in a sense, any contest with Ken Livingstone, it was always going to attract attention. And if you add that to that Boris Johnson, then it's attention squared, really. And this one, I think, is more like the sort of normal contest you see. Even in cities like New York and Paris, they don't always have national celebrities running to be mayors of those cities. And this contest is in some ways more of a test of the normal underlying response of the British political system, or the London political system, to this model. Will the turnout be lower? Well, it was only 37% last time, as one of the early charts would have shown. It's never been higher than about 45%. It would be hard, I think, at this moment to argue the turnout would be higher than the 37% achieved with Ken Livingstone facing off Boris Johnson last time. So it may be quite a low turnout. Question, would that help the Conservatives? Well, it might. My final point is that the results are often promised for this election in mid-afternoon. However, they rarely actually get announced till late at night. Now, we can but hope. There have been various alarms and excursions over the years, like leaking roofs at Alexandra Palace where the votes were being counted, machines that were switched on to slow, not fast. It's an electronic count, all sorts of things. So I, for one, would not expect the result to come in before early evening at the best on Friday, and they come in. I think it's is it sort of super constituency by super constituency. They declared at the three, I think there were going to be three counting centres, and they declared super constituency by super constituency. You have to add them up as you go along, but only when all of them are in can the final result, including the second preferences, be certain. So that's it, really. That's all I will say. Thank you very much. I'll hand over to Robin, who's going to talk about Bristol. I think.
Yes.
Okay, I'll move this along and then I can see the screen. Oh, that's great. I've just got to this.
I think you need that.
Yeah, you want to do that?
Okay,
I'll move
keep it over there. This.
Next week we change the line.
Thank you for your technical assistance there, Tony. So,
I'm going to sit here.
oh, okay. So I'm going to step away from London. You had some very helpful detailed analysis from Tony of what's happening in this metropolis. I'm going to talk about different places. Firstly, about international experience with directly elected mayors, then about Bristol. Can I just do some audience research? Do we have any colleagues from other countries actually in this room? Could you raise your hands, please, John? Oh, that's very, very encouraging for me, because I'm going to talk in the first part of what I wanted to say.
In French.
About, no, that is a step too far. But I did want to talk a little bit about the international trend towards directly elected mayors across the world. In my last job, I was in Chicago at the College of Urban Planning and Public Affairs at the University of Illinois in Chicago for 5 years. So I worked quite closely with Mayor Daley in those days and learned quite a lot about US mayoral leadership. But I'm really taking the chance to promote my new book called Leading the Inclusive City, which has just come out. We've got some flyers here. In it, I've spent about 5 years researching city leadership around the world. In it, the book has got 17 examples of inspirational leadership drawn from 14 countries covering all continents. In it, there are 8 examples of directly elected mayors having or are making a significant impact on their places. So I think we've got a trend towards directly elected mayors. Countries like Italy, Germany, Poland and Hungary have gone wholly in favour of elected mayors across the whole country, which we have not actually done yet, though we may be heading that way. I'm not wanting to sound like I'm promoting directly elected mayors, but I do think it's important to recognise that there's a significant international trend to strengthen what I call place-based leadership. That is different from placeless power. In the modern world, placeless power has grown enormously through global companies We do not care about place. But we have to, I'll give you a political picture here, we have to strengthen the power of place in modern democracies dramatically. So, we heard a little bit about London. There's a picture of George Ferguson, who's my mayor, directly elected mayor of Bristol, and I will come on to Bristol at the end of my brief presentation. But we've not really gone very far down this route compared with other countries. But as Tony mentioned, it's only 2000 yet. That's the first time we had any directly elected mayor. So you could say we're a little bit different than other places. I've got two slides here, one giving you the arguments in favour of directly elected mayors, and then one giving you the arguments against. I'm not going to go through it, I think colleagues in this room are pretty familiar. But there's a key argument about visibility, knowing who is leading, so you can hold them to account. The opposite argument is there's too much power in the hands of one individual, and that therefore reduces the quality of local democracy. And politics is weakened by having this model. I want to show you one last slide before I go to Bristol. This is the scandal that is largely undiscussed. My suggestion to you is that whether or not you have a directly elected mayor in your city, even after the devolution to the new city region mayors, you are still going to be relatively powerless in British cities and localities. This is because the central state is super centralising power year on year on year. And my colleagues in the finance departments at Bristol City Council helped me get some detailed figures on the level of government grant to Bristol City Council. Bristol City is not the worst in the country. 2010-11, 201 million support from central government, drops to 131 million in 2014-15. The plans for 2019-20, 45 million. That is a 78% cut in the central government funding to my city. That is going to decimate public services, and other parts of the country have got even a steeper decline. So as we talk about mayoral leadership and mayoral models, let's not forget what's going on behind the curtain. This is a public debate about directly actually going to make a difference. Have a look at that graph. It's traumatic what is happening, and I hope some of you will cover that aspect in what you write. Okay, that's my national context. The impact of Mayoral Bristol. This is a nice picture of Clifton Suspension Bridge over the Avon Gorge. It's totally irrelevant to my presentation, but at least it takes you out of London for a moment. It was the, as you know, it was the largest suspension bridge in the world when it was built in the 1860s with background. When we had a referendum in May 2012 in 10 cities, whether or not to have a directly elected mayor, 9 cities, Newcastle, Birmingham, and so on, said no, go away. 1 city said yes, we'll have a go at that, Bristol. So we decided, that's myself and a colleague, Dr. Sweeting, at the University of Bristol, so the 2 universities doing the study, let's rush ahead and try and do a before and after study of whether this mayoral model makes a difference in our city. So we got some funding to do some research before there was a mayor, before George Ferguson was elected in November 2012. Some quite good data of citizen opinions, but also of civic leaders. We interviewed 120 civic leaders, and we ran focus groups. We got a really good picture of what people felt about the government before there was a mayor. Then we come back later, 2014, and say, what's the difference? Have we got some changes to see here? And we have some criteria for measuring the quality of governance. It's not just about leadership, there are other aspects that matter. And they're in the handout there, I'm not going to run through them because of time, but these are fairly well-established ideas about how you might measure the quality of the governance system. Leadership, representation, legitimacy, effectiveness. Is it good value for money? Is there adequate scrutiny of the powerful leaders? Is it responsive? So that's embedded in all this research. So we're trying to run right across the board. I've got 2 slides just to pause and slow a little here. In the book that I've written, I've developed quite an extensive argument about the nature of leadership in places. And I suggest there are different realms of leadership in any given place. And this certainly, in my experience, works internationally. I'm going to keep it simple this morning, but the argument here is there might be three realms of leadership. The elected political figures that we're focusing on this morning. Now, public servants who work for the state, they're not elected, they're appointed by the political system. These people are important leaders in places. And they're often behind the screen a little, and they often do not say I'm a leader, I'm a manager, public manager, I'm a vice. But they're very important in improving the quality of governance in places. So that's the state. Over here we have the community and business interests that are involved to varying degrees in the running of the city and leading a city. In Chicago, you wouldn't understand anything really about how the city is led unless you understood the business world and their commitment and enthusiasm for their city. And in some cities, this is very important. Also, the community side. So, in this study of Bristol, we've got views of this group, and this group separated out. So as we evaluate the mayoral model, we can show that there's very different perceptions of what's actually happening with this new way of governing. The other dimension we're quite pleased about is to look at the socio-economic groups in the city and try and discover whether different classes have different views about mayoral governance. And it's very simple. We've got it based on the definition. Three groups. This is the map of the wards of Bristol. The blue is better off Bristol, Clifton and the central area here. Middle income is the red colour, and then you've got the poorer areas in green. We are the second wealthiest city after London in GDP per head, but we are, despite our wealth, a very divided city. So we've got uneven benefits flowing to the population. And I think it's interesting to get the views of these different groups when we think about change in the city. Okay, one or two charts just to illustrate that, one or two findings. We've got a report out, it's on the website. It's called The Impacts of Mayoral Governance in Bristol. And you can look at all the detail there if you want to. Firstly then, visibility of leadership. This is the views of citizens, not the leaders. Before you have a mayor, 24% think the city's got visible leadership. Afterwards, 69%. That is a spectacular increase in visibility of leadership because we have a directly elected mayor. The leadership of the council has a vision for the city, 25% before the election, before a mayor, 56%. So for those who are enthusiastic about mayoral leadership, that's quite impressive. And it's even more impressive if you find out the views of civic leaders, people more engaged in local politics. So, if we look at the councillors, who on the whole are fairly uncomfortable with the mayoral model, because their power's been diminished, even they think the visibility has gone up. 56% thought it was visible, now it's 78%. Have a look at this. The public managers, 23% thought the city had visible leadership before a mayor, 94% think it now. That is incredible. Even more, the business and community interests, 25% thought they had visible leadership before, 97%. So I think it's something to do with Mayor Ferguson and his personality, but I think we're trying to suggest something about the model of governance here that gives legitimacy to high-profile leadership. You've got very different views between the realms. I'll just give you one slide. This is a direct elected mayor will improve or has improved leadership. Politicians, not so sure it's going to do much. Only 28% thought that, and after the event, 31%. Public managers, pretty hopeful. 77% is going to be better, with 78%. Community business, again, in the 70s. So in the three rounds of leadership that I showed you, you've got very different interpretations and judgments about what's happening. I think this is my last slide on data. This is the one on the socio-economic groups. So if you look at the beginning in 2012, this is the better off, middle income, low income. There's quite a high level of hopes and aspirations about this new model will make a difference across the groups. Move on a couple of years and see what they think afterwards. The middle class is pretty happy about it. It's more or less what they thought, 67, 66. The middle income, a little bit of a drop. But look at this one. The poor in Bristol, had high aspirations. 62% thought it would make a significant difference. Not anymore. This is very relevant for the election on the 5th of May in Bristol, because there are different views about this governance model between different geographical parts of the city. Okay, I've got one last slide here, just to summarise a few points before we get into some debate. And this is really about the model of governance rather than the detail. I can answer questions about the detail of what's happening in Bristol politics, but it's more about the model. I think there's no doubt now that if you introduce a mayoral model of governance in a place, it alters power relationships. So the Cities and Local Government Devolution Act that came out in January will bring into being 9, at this point, 9 city region mayors have been discussed. Perhaps sure they'll all happen, there's a bit of debate in some of those. That will alter the power system in those city regions. Institutional design matters, reformers should pay more attention to it. I think we have to, these 2 points that I've made, we're thinking through, well, whose judgments are we using to assess these changes? And are we needing to pay more attention to different views about what's happening, and also about the different socioeconomic groups? But the main thing, the last thing I want to say is, and we're not talking about devolution as such in this morning's session, we are trying to focus on mayors, but please remember that central government is super centralising the state. I call it centralisation on steroids. We are witnessing a devolution deception. If you examine the Act and what it's doing, ministers are getting more and more power to control what happens in different places. So let's notice that that's going on. At the same time, let's have a debate about the individuals who we will elect as our elected mayors. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Right.